Attacking Iran, it's not the beginning of a war.
Right.
Attacking Iran is the end of the war.
Right.
And when President Trump talks about ending wars, in this specific case, unlike the Russian-Ukrainian war, a pinpointed attack on Iranian nuclear sites and military capabilities will bring an end to the war.
Mainstream media gives you the impression that there is nothing good about America. In direct contrast to that, my podcasts will prove by examples that America has always been and still is the land of opportunity for everyone.
Welcome to another episode in the series Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. My guest today is Amir Avivi, a former Brigadier General in the Israeli Defense Forces and currently the chairman of the Israel Defense and Security Forum, or IDSF. IDSF is an organization of former senior IDF officers and other concerned citizens of Israel, all of whom are ardent Zionists who lobby the government of Israel to ensure that it focuses on the security of the state of Israel. Tonight's discussion will focus on conflicts outside of Israel, which have a direct effect on Israel. Specifically today, the conflicts in Ukraine and Syria and in Yemen. During his 30 years of service in the Israel Defense Forces, General Avivi held a series of increasingly senior roles, for being the commander of various battalions to director of the Office of the Chief of Staff. For many years, General Avivi was at the center of the policy-making process in both the Israeli government and in its defense establishment. After leaving government in 2019, General Avivi founded the Israel Defense and Security Forum. General Avivi is here today to discuss current military conflicts outside of Israel that, as I said, have an effect on Israel. His observations are more meaningful than others that you might see in the media because of both his military experience and because he knows what is going on in Israel. He enjoys weekly access to the highest levels because of his 30 years of military and government experience, and also because as head of IDSF, he can talk directly to government officials in Israel every week, up to and including Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister. Welcome to the show again, General Avivi.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. It's a real pleasure.
There are a number of serious military conflicts happening in the world today outside of Israel, and some of them have a direct bearing on the security of Israel. One of those conflicts is in Syria. On December of last year, rebel Islamic forces entered Damascus, leading to the fall of the Assad regime. Now, you know, Assad was an enemy of Israel, but given the radical background of the de facto new leader, Mohammed al-Jolani, he might not be any better. So, was the fall of Assad a positive development or not for Israel?
Well, I think that in one way it's positive, in other ways it's negative. It's positive in the sense that al-Jolani forces, as terrible as they are enemies of Hezbollah. So now Syria has become a place that is hostile to Hezbollah, and they prevent the smuggling of weapons into Lebanon. They are fighting Hezbollah. Hezbollah, throughout the civil war in Syria, has butchered them again and again. So this creates a conflict between Hezbollah and the forces in Syria, and in this sense, this is positive. On the other hand, we're talking about al-Jolani, who grew in ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Jabhat Nusra, all these really radical Sunni organizations. And these forces are conducting, as we speak, terrible ethnic cleansing in the western part of Syria against the Alawis, the Syrians who supported the Assad regime. Just this last week or two, they killed thousands. They're butchering them in the streets, children, women, men, terrible videos that they are releasing. And if they manage to really weaponize, they might be a big danger to Israel. They are backed up by Turkey. Turkey is a radical Sunni entity. Radwan is a very radical person and is supporting these radical elements together with Qatar. So the Turks now are really affecting what's going on in Syria. And in a future scenario, we might see Turkey on Israeli borders. So in this sense, looking in the long term, it might be challenging. And Israel has created 30 miles perimeter from the Israeli border all the way to Damascus with a very clear message. We won't allow any armed forces to move south of Damascus towards the Syrian part of the Golan. And Israel is constantly attacking forces who are trying to move south. Even yesterday, there was an Air Force attack north of Damascus, actually, an area where there were some tanks left and some capabilities of the former Syrian army that these rebels tried to seize. And Israel, throughout the last few months, has destroyed almost completely all the Syrian army to make sure that the weapons don't fall into the hands of these jihadists.
So why is Turkey involved in Syria? Why do they care about Syria?
Turks, the way they think, they want to restore the Ottoman Empire. They used to control for 400 years the whole region, all the way to Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And Radwan, from the first day he became a prime minister and later president, put a clear vision. We are going to be again the Ottoman Empire. And they are trying to expand any way they can, and not only in this area, also in Libya and other places. The Turks are building a huge army. They have built a very dominant and strong military industries. They want to be a world power. This is how they look at themselves, just as the US or Russia. They see themselves as a world power. They want to be an Ottoman Empire again, and this is why they're acting the way they are.
I see. And from my understanding, Turkey is about 75% Sunni. Is that correct? Which is in opposition to Iran, which is Shia.
Right. Turks are Sunnis, and they've become much more religious in the last decade under Radwan. Before that, when they became a modern country, they tried to be much more Western and modernized. Started producing beer, alcohol, although they are Muslims. But Turkey has changed, and not for the best. They've become more radical, more religious, and back to the old aspirations of being an empire.
So, actually, Syria, if it gets a serious presence in Syria, would pose a threat to Israel.
Definitely. Turks are weaponizing these jihadi elements, this new Syrian government. They're training them. And Syria now is predominantly controlled by Turkey. Before that, before al-Julani conquered most of Syria, it was controlled by Iran and by Russia. But the Russians, due to the Russian-Ukrainian war, most of their forces left Syria to fight in Ukraine. Iranians took advantage and took control of big parts of Syria and enabled all the smuggling to Hezbollah. And now it's Turkey. that has dominance in Syria, but they don't control all of Syria. You have a region in the west, in the east, of Syria that is controlled by the Kurds, who are enemies of Turkey. You have an area near the Israeli border that is controlled by the Druze, and Israel is defending the Druze on the Syrian side, with Israeli forces deployed inside Syria and in the Hermon mountain. And in the west of Syria, you have the towns and cities of the Alawis. The Alawis are similar to the Shias, and they're enemies of these radical Sunnis. And as we speak, they are being butchered by Al-Julani forces.
You know what's incredible? We don't hear anything about the ethnic cleansing of the Alawites on our news in America. We hear nothing about it.
You know, they say no Jews, no news.
Yeah, if you know, right. Either the Jews are being killed or killing, that would be news. Now, Turkey is a member of NATO, but yet, and they're against the Kurds, and the U.S. is supplying or assisting the Kurds, from what I understand. Is that correct?
Yes, the U.S. to a certain extent is assisting the Kurds. The Kurds are not just in Syria. They're also inside Iraq. They're also inside Turkey. And the Turks have been fighting their own civilians, Kurd civilians inside Turkey. The Kurds had for a very long time an organization called PKK that fought the Turkish government. The Kurds are a big nation, spread also in Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, tens of millions of people, but were never able really to unite as one nation. As we speak, the Al-Julani forces have discussions with the Kurds to agree to some kind of Kurd autonomy. And the Turks are continuing all the time to fight the Kurds and attack them.
Now, are the Kurds Muslims?
Yeah, of course. The Kurds are Muslim, but they have their own kind of
their own
beliefs.
Flavor. Are the Druze Muslims?
No. The Druze, it's a religion. The Druze believe that they descend from Yitro, the father of Zipporah, the wife of Moses. Yitro, by the way, became Jewish. And they believe that they are cousins of the Jews.
I understand that in Israel, the Druze are able to join the military. They have all the rights of Israelis.
All Israeli citizens have all the rights of Israelis, but the Druze, from the very beginning, from the independence war, have joined hands with the Jewish people and are serving in the army in many positions. In my organization, in IDSF, I have 5 Druze generals and many Druze that served in the country. They're an integral part of the Israeli society, and they serve the country.
Now, my understanding is the Druze, by their very nature, are loyal to the country where they live. But now, the ones living in Syria, and approximately 700,000 Druze live in Syria. And what country are they going to be loyal to? There is no country.
So it's interesting that, after 1967, when Israel liberated the Golan Heights, we had Druze living in the Golan, and for years and years, they remained loyal to the Syrians, not to Israel.
Right.
But since the civil war in Syria and the big changes inside Syria, and when Sunni radical elements and the Iranians started threatening them, and Syria pretty much ceased to be, a real country. The sentiment has changed. It's changed first in the Israeli Golan, And now that they're petrified from Julani forces and also from the Iranians, the Druze have been sending messages to Israel saying, we want to be part of Israel, or at least under Israeli defense. Many years ago, Israel thought about creating a Druze state in the Syrian part of the Golan as a strategy.
Great.
And now, in a way, it's becoming a reality. And Israel is defending the Druze on the Syrian side, even thinking about letting them work in Israel. And this is the reality we see now in Syria.
General, do you think that Israel will interfere in Syria to protect the Druze?
Israel is interfering in Syria. Israeli forces are inside Syria, in a perimeter inside Syria, and we are actively defending the Druze inside Syria and actively operating on an everyday basis to make sure that al-Julani forces don't move south of Damascus. We are not going to enable any terror army to be near our borders. This is the number one lesson from the 7th of October. No terror armies on Israel border. It's not going to happen, not in Lebanon, not in Syria, not in Gaza, and also not on the mountains of Judah and Samaria. Israel is being very proactive, making sure they cannot build up again after we defeated Hezbollah in Lebanon, after the fall of the Syrian regime. And we have still a lot of work to do in Gaza and also in Judah and Samaria.
Excellent. So how far has Israel extended its border into Syria to create a buffer zone to protect northern Israel?
So,
that's what it, most people don't get it. Israel is not interested in getting bigger. That's not the goal of Israel. It's not interested in taking on territory. It's interested in protecting its homeland. And in order to do that, it has to take over some land. So how much land is it going to take over or occupy?
So Israel went into Syria a few miles, but Israel created a perimeter of almost 30 miles.
Perfect.
That we control from the air,
yes,
not from the ground. And we keep monitoring the area, making sure that no forces go into the Syrian part of the Golan. And this gives us a buffer zone of 30 miles, which is very, very meaningful.
Perfect. Next, let's move on to the war in Ukraine. Now, most people wouldn't think that the war in Ukraine could have an impact on Israel, but it does. Soon after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, about 3 years ago, the U.S. transferred most of the munitions that it had stored in Israel to Ukraine. And in January of this year, just 2 months ago, the U.S. transferred 90 Patriot air defense interceptors from Israel to Ukraine. All of that was very good news for Ukraine, but certainly bad news for Israel. Was the loss of those munitions a problem for IDF? And how did it get around that loss?
So definitely the fact that the U.S. has been deeply involved in the Russian-Ukrainian war, sending huge amounts of munitions and capabilities, and taking capabilities from Israel. This affected Israel's ability to fight at the beginning of the war in Israel. And even before the war, the fact that the U.S. Became very busy in two arenas, one, the Russian-Ukrainian war, and the other one, the Pacific, building huge bases in the Philippines, getting ready for a possible confrontation with China. It was threatening to invade Taiwan. This created a reality where the U.S. Started withdrawing from the Middle East. We saw with that in the withdrawal from Afghanistan that was devastating. In 1 week, Afghanistan went back 20 years. Like nothing happened in the 20 years that the U.S. was in Afghanistan. And this sent a very strong message throughout the Middle East that the U.S. is weak The U.S. is withdrawing. The U.S. has lost interest in this area. And while this was happening, in the Middle East, we saw the rise of a Chinese, Russian, Iranian front that really, really emboldened the Iranians and gave them an understanding that this is their moment. The U.S. is not present almost at all. They're backed up by the Russians and by the Chinese. This gave them really the certainty that they can fight Israel the way they started doing on the 7th of October.
Now, those moves to take the munitions out of storage in Israel, which were meant for use in the Middle East, to take them out and put them to Ukraine, and for the Patriot batteries to move those were all done under the prior Biden administration. So has Trump restocked Israel with needed munitions for its conflicts in southern Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Gaza? Has Trump restocked any of this? What is the status now?
So Israel now is getting huge amounts of munitions from the U.S., whether it's artillery, mostly Air Force munitions for Iron Dome, and the other capabilities. And this is dramatic for Israel in our ability to really fight a seven-front war, which has been going on for a year and a half. And we have very big challenges ahead with Gaza and also with Iran. So definitely there is a very big change that enables Israel to sustain the war and achieve our missions.
Right. So other than the exchange or the transfer of munitions, how does the Ukraine war in America's position or change of position, how does that affect Israel?
It's a matter of really where do you focus? We have to understand what's happening in Ukraine and why America wants to end the war and support the Russians. We have to understand the global implications. For the U.S., the number one enemy is China.
Right.
This is the big deal. And when President Trump saw that throughout the last administration of Biden, there was a creation of a Russian, Chinese, Iranian front, the first thing this administration of Trump understood, they need to dismantle this front. Mm-hmm. You want China isolated. So how do you do it? Looking at the Iranians, you want to weaken them. I think that the best solution with Iran is to attack. We need to destroy their nuclear sites. We need an Israeli-American attack on the nuclear sites of Iran. We need to cut the head of the snake. So at least the way I see it, I think Israel sees it that way. The way to deal with the Iranians is a pinpointed air attack on their capabilities to really dismantle the Shia axis in the Middle East and take them out of the equation. Mm-hmm. But when you talk about the Russians, the US doesn't intend to have a war with Russia. If you want to bring the Russians on the side of the West, of the US, and not siding with China, you need to cut a deal. Mm-hmm. So the US has supported dramatically Ukraine.
Under Biden, yeah.
Yeah, under Biden, of course. And a lot of munitions to such an extent that the US is left almost with no munitions. And this is dangerous to the US national security. Mm-hmm. And with all this assistance, the Ukrainians haven't been able to push back the Russians. The Russians, slowly but steadily, are gaining more and more ground in Ukraine. They conquered the whole Donbas region, Crimea, and it seems that all these investments in Ukraine are not really changing the reality. The situation in Ukraine is devastating, and this is why President Trump wants to end the war, He sees that there is no chance that Ukraine will be able to push back the Russians. So the way he looks at it, he says the best thing now is cut the losses, say, okay, that's it. We have to stop the war. The Russians gained whatever they gained, but let's cut a deal with them, make sure they move into the West and not siding with the Chinese. And this will have a huge impact on Israel also, because for Israel it was devastating that Russia, a country Israel had good relations with, sided completely with Iran, weaponized Iran, assisted Iran, it became almost, I would say, an enemy of Israel. Before that, we had good relations. We were coordinated in Syria. The fact that the Russians are less strong in Syria, this is impacting also Israel, because this is giving the Turks the strength and capability to really impact what's going on in Syria. I think that if we'll see the Russians again more dominant in the western part of Syria, in the area of Latakia, in the ports, this will deter the Turks. And this for us is important. We want to see the Turks deterred, not invading or going into Syria. A Russian presence there might help Israel a lot. And this is why these changes are also favorable for Israel.
Okay, so trying to summarize, if the war in Ukraine ends, then that will enable Russia to put troops back into western or southern Syria, which is helpful to Israel and helpful to the Middle East.
Yes, and also I would expect the U.S. to demand from Russia to stop assisting Iran, to also stand with the U.S. regarding the war of Israel in Gaza. So having the Russians on our side, this is a very, very big deal. Now, talking about China, this will mean that the U.S. will be able to surround China, contain it, almost from all sides, and change the balance of power, because this Russian-Chinese front became a big challenge for U.S. dominance globally. And you really want to separate between the Russians and the Chinese that, by the way, have been rivals throughout history. So when you look at really the global challenges, it's crucial to dismantle this Chinese-Russian-Iranian front and make sure that Russia stands more with the West and not the East. You don't want to create a strong Eastern front that will challenge the U.S. globally.
Very interesting analysis. Very clear.
You know, people have a tendency to involve emotions in global strategic issues. People became very supportive of Ukraine. I must say, from a Jewish perspective, 1 million Jews were butchered in Ukraine.
Right.
Ukraine has never supported Israel, always votes against Israel in the UN. So I think that when we as Israelis look at this Russian-Ukrainian war, we don't have sentiments for Russians or Ukrainians. We need to look what is best for Israel. And what is best for Israel is make sure that the focus of the U.S. is in the Middle East, that the U.S. sees it as a priority to support Israel, that we break this Russian, Chinese, Iranian front. It's important globally, but also regionally. And this is why, when I look at it from an Israeli perspective, I think that the policy of President Trump in Ukraine is the right policy. I think that the West has done huge mistakes with Russia. We tend to look at Russians as aggressors, but we have to remember that looking at it from Russian eyes, the West has invaded Russia many times. And the US has invaded Russia at the end of the First World War, UK, Sweden, Germany, Napoleon. So the Russians have a whole history of the West attacking them, and they feel they need strategic depth. The distance between the border of Ukraine and the Russian capital of Moscow is roughly 65, 70 miles.
Ooh,
it's nothing.
Wow. I didn't know that.
It's very, very close. So they feel vulnerable. Now, when the USSR fell, Europe started absorbing more and more countries into the European Union.
And these countries were on the border or between Western Europe and Russia. So we were extending our sphere of influence toward Russia, which they didn't like.
Yeah. Now, one thing is having countries joining the European Union. This is okay.
Right.
It's mostly an economical union. But what Europe and the US did,
right, NATO,
they started bringing these countries into NATO.
Mistake, right.
NATO is a military coalition. And when you see country after country joining a military coalition, the Russians are asking themselves, why? Why is the West enlarging a military coalition?
In our direction,
now,
in their direction.
Everything we are experiencing now, specifically talking about Ukraine, started in 2005. In 2005, there was a NATO summit in Romania, and there they had a declaration. We want to bring Ukraine into NATO. For the Russians, it means that NATO will be 70 miles from Moscow.
I see. It's as if, one second, it's as if the Russians were putting missiles in Cuba. Same thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same.
I get it.
And then Russia released a non-paper, which, by the way, my father, when he was an ambassador, received personally from the Russians, saying, we're not going to agree. We're going to do anything we need to do to make sure Ukraine won't be in NATO. And also, there are big parts of Ukraine that are belong to Russia. This is for throughout history, Ukraine was part of Russia, and especially the eastern part, which is the Russian population that wants to be part of Russia. So Crimea is ours, Donbas, the eastern part of Ukraine is ours. And if you continue this process, we're going to take over these areas. As I've said that from 2005. And what we saw in the last few years, on one hand, we saw the weakness of the US, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the US becoming less of a global power. But also this process talking about Ukraine joining NATO, and this was a red line for the Russians. And they said, okay, that's it. And we are going to war. I think that really the West has done huge mistakes, huge. Not understanding the Russian mentality, not understanding their core interest. And I think that President Trump has a much, much better of an understanding of what these core interests are and how to stabilize overall the situation by really taking seriously this core interest in a way that will create stability between Russia and Europe, and really try to push Russia back into the West and out of Chinese hands.
I would say pull Russia to the West, not push, but that's right. I understand exactly.
Pull, right.
And
Pull.
your description and your analysis is exceptionally good. And we just had a Russian expert, David Satter, who takes an opposing point of view on this. He thinks America, as I recall, should support Ukraine. So it's possible in the future we're going to set up a three-way debate between the two of you, because you both have very strong points based on knowledge. So that would be wonderful to do.
I think that people tend to mix morality and interests.
Yeah.
And try to, to bring moral arguments into real politics. This is something that might be dangerous. Now, look, it's like investing in a stock. If you put more and more money into a stock and the stock continues to fall, it's a problem. If Ukraine was able to take this huge assistance the US gave and push back the Russians, that would be an amazing investment. It didn't happen. And the investments are huge and are affecting the US national security situation. That's the US is running out of munitions.
We're running out of money. We can't continue with this deficit.
Right. So this is a big lesson, by the way, looking at Israel. Israel needs to understand, I think we do understand it now. Israel needs to be able to defend itself by itself. And if we get assistance, we need to show that for every dollar, we're able to bring back between $5 to $10. Yeah. So for the US investing in Israel, it's investing in an amazing stock. So you need to show that when you get assistance, you actually use the money in a way that really makes a difference. And Israel is managing to do that. In Ukraine, what can we do? Not so much.
Right. And nobody should ask you to.
Right.
All right, let's move on to Yemen. Under President Biden, the U.S. military took actions but didn't take meaningful actions against the Houthis. Do you think that under President Trump, the U.S. military will take decisive action and thereby taking one of Israel's problems off its enemy list?
You know, what amazes me about the Houthis in Yemen is that they're undermining on a daily basis maybe the most important thing globally for everybody.
Shipping.
It's world trade, shipping.
Right.
I cannot understand how the West
allows
coalition,
this. How does it allow this?
Doesn't attack them fiercely. How can the world live with a reality where ships cannot move into the Red Sea and they need to go around Africa? This takes global prices high. You know, they are skyrocketing. It takes a lot of time to move the goods. It's affecting everybody. The most basic thing you expect from the US, from Britain, even from Russia, is to secure world trade. This is the most basic thing that needs to happen. And you have these Houthis undermining world trade, and nobody is doing anything serious. The only serious attack the Houthis experience is Israel.
Yeah. It's incredible. It's raising the price of everything for everyone around the world, this having to divert around Africa. And we allow it. And this is a nothing entity, right? The rebels in Houthi, they're a small entity, right? They could be easily destroyed.
Definitely. I know they're not that small, but definitely the U.S. shouldn't have any problem to do a decisive strike on their capabilities. This is an Iranian militia, equipped and trained by Iran.
Yeah.
And as part of the dismantling of this Shia axis, we need to deal with the Houthis in a decisive way.
Okay, next, let's move on to Gaza. President Trump issued 2 ultimatums to Hamas. First, in January, when he was not president, he was president-elect. He issued an ultimatum to Hamas demanding the release of all Israeli hostages, and he said, by 12 p.m. on Saturday, February 15th, 2025. I don't know how he chose that date, but that's what he said. He warned that failure to comply would result in severe consequences. And he stated, and I'm going to quote, as far as I'm concerned, if all of the hostages aren't returned by Saturday at 12 o'clock, I would say cancel the ceasefire, all bets are off, and let hell break loose. That was his first ultimatum. Then, just a week or so ago, he issued another stern warning to Hamas, and here's what he said, and I'm going to quote, Shalom Hamas. And shalom means either hello, and it also means goodbye. You can choose. Release all the hostages now, not later, and immediately return all of the dead bodies of the people you murdered, or it is over for you. Only sick and twisted people keep bodies, and you are sick and twisted. I am sending Israel everything it needs to finish the job. Not a single Hamas member will be safe. It will be safe if you don't do as I say. I have just met with your former hostages whose lives have been destroyed. This is your last warning. He said it twice. Now, given President Trump's strong support for Israel, why hasn't Israel taken the opportunity to restart the war and put an end to Hamas?
Israel is trying to get as many hostages out as possible. The Israeli public overall expect the government to try to really do everything they can do to take out as many hostages as possible before we launch a decisive attack again in Gaza. I think that the Prime Minister, from really, I would say, political considerations, he needs the society's support in the attack, tries to really get as many hostages as possible. Now, look, I have huge appreciation for everything President Trump is doing, for his support for Israel, for the assistance, for everything. But I think that talking, threatening is not enough. You need to show you are doing something. And in the Middle East, talking won't do the job. I think that the U.S. needs to show, at least in one place, that they mean business. Whether it's launching an attack on the Iranian nuclear sites.
We'll get back to it in a minute.
Whether it's the Houthis. And as far as Hamas, I would have expected the U.S. to do one simple thing that would have changed everything. Send a clear message to Qatar, to Egypt, and to Turkey. You have 1 week to hand us all the leadership of Hamas, all of them to Guantanamo, and that's it. You need to put real pressure, and real pressure is arresting all the leadership of Hamas. They are sitting in hotels in Qatar and in Egypt and in Turkey. They have killed dozens of Americans. They've taken American hostages, not even talking about Israelis. Why don't demand to arrest them? Now, the moment you'll have the leadership of Hamas in an American jail, I can promise you, you'll see the hostages. So I think that the U.S. has very strong tools that is not using. And the fact that the U.S. chooses to speak directly to Hamas, this is unprecedented.
Yeah.
This didn't even happen with Biden. I think it's not understanding the culture and who we're dealing with. So I think that we're in a very defining moment where the U.S. needs to start using other tools, including military ones, against the enemies to really make a huge change and create the terms needed to release the hostages. I don't think we can sustain for long a reality where we are in a ceasefire, hostages are not released, and we're not putting military pressure. A few days more, a week or two more, if hostages are not released, Israel will have to go to a full-scale attack on Gaza, and this attack is going to be decisive. It's going to be an attack that when it will end, Hamas will be destroyed. That's a military and governmental entity. The army is ready. The new chief of staff has approved all the plans. And these plans look like nothing like the beginning of the war. Because at the beginning of the war, as we were degrading Hamas, all the time we were thinking we need to keep the forces fresh. They need to fight in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. Hezbollah is the big enemy. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we operated in ways that kept our forces in readiness to move to the north. But now we won in Lebanon, we won in Syria, we degraded the grammatically terror in Judea and Samaria, and the IDF is able to focus on Gaza. We have the munitions, we have the manpower, we have a new leadership in the army, we have the U.S. support, and I expect to see in the coming months a decisive win in Gaza.
Well, I would disagree with the first part of your statement here regarding the U.S. has to take steps to force this and that. This is not a U.S. issue. Yes, everything globally affects everything, but Gaza is an Israeli issue. And I don't think that Trump has to or must put pressure on Qatar or Egypt or Iran to get the hostages released. It's an Israeli problem. And he's given Israel all the support, diplomatic support and military support for Israel to solve the problem. Now, it's up to Israel, probably Netanyahu, to say we are solving the problem and declare if the ceasefire is over anyway, right? It ended. They haven't agreed to a new extension. So it's time to go in there now and to forget about the hostages. It sounds cruel, but those people should be considered to be dead. We can't delay. Every day we delay, they are getting stronger. They are setting booby traps. They are rearming somehow. They are getting ready for an invasion. We had the upper hand, and now we're losing it, and we appear weak, especially because Trump says, I'm with you. He must be frustrated.
I think that because President Trump directly threatened them, and it was a U.S. threat, he could have said, Israel, do whatever you need to do. I'll support you. I'll give you munitions, give you everything you need. But the moment it's an American threat on Hamas, and he puts the red line.
No, I disagree. It's not up to him to put the red. No, it's not up to America to put the red line. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. This is.
But it happened. And therefore, if America gets involved and America puts the red line, then America needs to take some kind of action. Israel doesn't expect the U.S. to fight for us in Gaza. This is our business. And we're going to fight in Gaza. But I think that if Hamas killed so many American citizens, the easiest thing to do, you don't have to fight. Say to Qatar. Hand them over.
You can say that, but there has to be or else. What's the or else that you're going to say to Qatar or to Egypt or to Iran? What's the or else? There has to be an or
Egypt
else.
cannot stand without American assistance, just as Ukraine. America is giving Egypt billions. If they stop supporting them, Egypt will collapse. America is defending Qatar by having an American base in
That's right.
Qatar. If
Shouldn't
the
be
US
there.
removes this base,
Shouldn't be there.
Qatar will be invaded by Iran in no time. These entities or countries are completely dependent on the US, and the US has huge leverage on them.
Yes, but okay, all right.
Just like he's dealing with Ukraine.
Okay.
Ukraine is very dependent on the US. He has leverage over Zelensky.
Well, the best leverage that Trump has is giving Israel the free hand and the weapons to finish the job. That's the best leverage. I don't think the U.S. should demand anything from anybody else about this. It's Israel's problem. Okay, we don't agree, but we do agree that if something doesn't happen soon, then Israel is going to act.
Definitely. I don't see any scenario where Israel is not going back to war. Right. I think it's a matter of weeks, days, who knows?
Yeah.
Hard to predict.
Finally, Iran. I understand that Iran's supreme leader just rejected President Trump's written offer to negotiate the end to Iran's quest for nuclear weapons. We don't know what's in the letter, but I suspect it had something to do. You have to give up nuclear weapons, and that's it, or else. That's my interpretation of what's in the letter. Is that yours too? What do you think is in the letter?
So the number one interest of the Iranian regime is to exist. They want to maintain the regime. They were relying mostly on their proxies, on Hezbollah, the Houthis, the militias in Iraq, Syria, to defend the regime, and they're losing more and more assets. Hezbollah was hit hard. They lost Syria. Houthis have been attacked, and they're less stronger. The militias in Iraq have been deterred and stopped intervening in the war. Israel attacked in Iran and deprived them from their air defense, and also attacked some nuclear sites. And Iran has weakened a lot. The regime is feeling vulnerable, and in this reality, they feel that the only thing that can defend them is nuclear weapons. So they're moving fast. They are moving fast towards nuclear capabilities. And what they want to do as a strategy is talk it out, have negotiations, and while talking is going on, procure and build nuclear capabilities. And this is not an option. Iran cannot be nuclear. It's a global threat. It's not just a threat on Israel.
Yeah, this is where
it's a global threat. It's a regional threat. And therefore, I really believe that with Iran, there's only one solution, and this is destroying their nuclear sites. It doesn't require a lot of time. I've seen estimates. One estimate talks about
2 weeks.
8 hours American attack on these sites, American-Israeli. Some talk about a day, 2, 3. But attacking Iran, it's not the beginning of a war.
Right.
Attacking Iran is the end of the war.
Right.
When President Trump talks about ending wars, in this specific case, unlike the Russian-Ukrainian war, a pinpointed attack on Iranian nuclear sites and military capabilities will bring an end to the war. And this is why it's so important to do it. And this is the place where the US needs to send a global message. We're back. We're not afraid to use military power. And this is important, not just talking about the Middle East and Iran. This is important if you want to deter the Chinese from invading Taiwan. This is important if you want to deter the Russians to understand that the US is the leading global power, and it's not afraid to use its power where needed. America must stand strong somewhere. It's not going to work just by threatening and talking. You need to show you are willing to use power. This globe is, challenging, and you see the level of violence in different regions and places. In the last year, before President Trump, the globe has gone out of control. 56 different wars and confrontations around the world. 200,000 people died last year. Why? Because of lack of American leadership. And I think that President Trump gets it. He understands that he needs to stabilize the globe. He's talking about peace. He's talking about stability, but he's talking about peace through strength. You need to be strong in order to have a globe that is stabilized and without all this endless amount of wars that we are seeing in the last year.
So I imagine you believe, like I do, that his letter was very clear that we can have peace with Iran, you can be a member of the world community, but you have to give up, and we have to be able to verify that you've given up the quest for nuclear arms. That has to be what was in the letter, right?
Yeah, I think that he definitely intends to demand the complete dismantling of nuclear capabilities.
Right.
The question is, what is the time frame?
Right. So
how much time do they have?
So they rejected it. And, President Trump started many months ago, or since January, we're going to negotiate with Iran. And that's a good start. But if they refuse to negotiate, then what will happen next? And when do you think next is? When is next?
So I think that the way this regime is disrespecting the U.S. shows that they believe that the U.S. doesn't have the willingness to use military power.
Right.
And the only way to really give a clear understanding, not only to them, or to everybody, to the Chinese, to the Russians, to the North Koreans, that the U.S. has the will, is show on the ground that it happened and attack them. I think that we don't have time. We don't have time. They are enriching uranium. They are moving fast towards nuclear capabilities. And we see what happens when a country like that has nuclear capabilities. You see it with North Korea.
Right.
And really the inability of the U.S. to deal with them. They are a nuclear power.
Right, too late.
And they are deterring the U.S. And this is not a reality you can have with Iran. Because Iran is not North Korea. Iran wants global domination. They want to control the whole globe.
Yeah, it's a religious fanaticism. A religious fanaticism, right? That's what it's driven by. And there's no logic. General, I want to thank you for spending time with me again to share your insights into how all of these various armed conflicts outside of Israel have a potentially serious effect on the state of Israel. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Bob.
And thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob, please subscribe and you'll be automatically notified of future podcasts in this series.
Thanks so much for listening to another episode of Life Lessons with Dr. Bob. If you enjoyed these interviews with some of today's most influential thought leaders, please follow and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. And don't forget, you can also watch each episode on YouTube as well. We'll see you next time.